Hey everyone! In this module, we're talking about theories of adult learning. And adult learning theories are based on the assumption that adults and children learn differently. For example, adult learners come into their education with a lot of lived experience, and they're cognitively more advanced. And it's also suggested that adults could be motivated differently to learn. Our article this week by Griffin also talks about how diverse our classes can be in adult education, such as diversity in age, the family history of post-secondary education, time away from school. Griffin also mentions that a lot of professors don't have training on how to teach in general and specifically teaching adult learners. And I believe our reading by Alan also mentioned that. We're going to talk specifically about teaching adult learners, although this isn't the only opportunity for you to explore adult learning this semester. And in this video, we're going to be focusing particularly on andragogy, often called adult learning theory or adult learning principles. So before we delve into any specific learning theories here, let's talk about why theory is even important in educational practice in the first place. So why does it even matter? And this is something I initially pondered quite a bit in my own master's degree. As I mentioned in my bio, I wasn't really interested in research when I went into my master's degree, and I actually wanted to be a nurse educator in a hospital. So I did question about whether or not I needed to know this, and is theory even relevant? And something that I have come to understand, especially since coming to the Faculty of Education, is yes, it's absolutely relevant to practice. Theory isn't something that's just for academics, it's very relevant to our practice as educators. Our article by Kaufman this week opens up by asking how many times as educators we've been confronted with situations where, such as for example when we feel lost and like we're just flying by the seat of our pants, and we may feel like we need some sort of set of guiding principles. For example, in fall 2020, I was asked to teach a class. I was asked on a Wednesday night, and my first class was that Friday morning, and I felt completely lost. And even with this course, I didn't get a whole lot of notice. So in both cases, I turned to complexity science and adult learning theory or adult learning principles to help me plan my classes, and some other theories too, to a lesser extent, like community of practice, social constructivism, behaviorism, but we'll come back to all these other learning theories give us that guiding set of principles that inform our teaching. And learning theories can also help us understand what drives and impedes learning, and putting principles of learning theories into practice can help improve learning. And there's a number of different learning theories out there, as I'm sure you're well aware, and that's because there's more than one type of learning. So different learning theories are helpful in learning contexts. So with that, let's talk about how we got here with adult learning theories. So in the early 20th century, post-secondary education was very heavily informed by behavioristic psychology, and we will talk more about behaviorism next week, don't worry. But in short, this approach sees learning as being about changes in observable behavior. And our reading by Alan this week describes this approach as education as students being given a stimulus, like a lecture, and then assessed and then provided with a reward or a punishment, in other words, a grade. And we still see principles of behavior change approach to learning in some elements of adult education, especially in healthcare with evidence-based practice. We can also see it, for example, in the military and with things like self-help programs. However, we do start to see a shift in the mid-20th century to more of a humanistic psychology perspective, which emphasizes personal growth and development in learning rather than being about changes in behavior. So these theories, and this branch of inquiry in particular, looks at how adult learning can be distinguished from childhood learning. And three major theories emerged during this time from within this perspective of adult learning: andragogy, which we're going to talk about today, self-directed learning, and transformative learning. And there are a number of different theories of adult learning. Like I said before, there isn't just one theory to explain adult learning. And so this table I've shown you here isn't exhaustive, it's just meant to give you a few examples. So from cognitive psychology, we have cognitism and constructivism, which we'll be talking about in the next couple of modules, as well as experiential learning theory and reflective learning or reflective practice, which I'm planning to do a part 2 on this to discuss. Within humanistic psychology, as I said, we have andragogy, self-directed learning, and transformative learning. And within social anthropology, we have community of practice and situated learning, which we'll be covering later in this course, and cognitive apprenticeship. So with that, let's talk about andragogy. So this is also called adult theory or adult learning principles, and I think this is what people think of most when we talk about theories of adult learning. And this began to emerge as a separate method of teaching with the publication of American adult educator Malcolm Knowles' The Adult Learner in 1973. And here he claimed that adults learn differently than children, so we should teach them differently. And a big difference here being that adult learners are more self-directed. Now, there were other educationalists working on theories surrounding adult learning, particularly in Europe, I believe. But at least within the North American context, Knowles is very much the one who popularized this idea. And this differentiation from teaching children is where the term andragogy comes from. So the term comes from ancient Greek, and I don't know if I even want to try and pronounce this because I'm not fluent in ancient Greek, but basically it comes from man or adult, so andra, and agogos, leader of, so leader of man. Whereas pedagogy comes from pes or paid, which means boy or child. So when we're talking about where these words come from, pedagogy is referring to teaching children, whereas andragogy is talking about teaching adults. Often pedagogy is used to refer to both, but if we're actually breaking down where the word comes from, it does just refer to teaching children. Just a fun fact for you. And in andragogy, there's 6 major assumptions about adult learning. Now, there's 4 or 5, like in the Kaufman article, and this is because when this theory or these principles were initially published, there were only 4, and 2 were added later on. I've also seen some sites who list his 6 principles, and they're not Knowles' principles. I don't know where they got them from. So the principles I'm sharing here do come from Knowles' 4th edition of his Adult Learning Theories book. So the first principle is need to know. So adults need to know why they need to learn something. So our adult learners want to know the benefit they'll receive from learning something versus the consequences of not learning it. So something we can do here as educators is show our learners how they can use this learning in real life, since especially with more novice learners, this may not be immediately obvious. The second principle is self-concept. So our adults are independent and self-directing. Adults have a self-concept that they are responsible for their decisions and their lives. And Knowles states that once they've reached this self-concept, they need to be treated by others as though they are capable of this self-direction. And the Griffin article talks about how they call others, so very much treating them as adults who are self-directed, I would say. And they found that it did seem to help develop positive self-esteem amongst the learners. And adult learners may resent or even resist situations where others are imposing their will on them. So we really want to allow our learners to draw on their experiences and their knowledge, and that conveys that their contributions are valued and respected by their educators. And I think within this also, like Alan talks about, we need to acknowledge that they have other responsibilities like jobs and families, and we need to allow for that flexibility to accommodate that. Principle 3 is learners' experience. So our adult learners accumulate a growing reservoir of experience, which is a very rich resource for learning. So our adult learners are coming into their education with a wealth of experience. And that's not to say that children don't have experiences too, but our adult learners have lived longer and they've accumulated different experiences that a child wouldn't necessarily have, like having a job, being a tax-paying voting citizen, things like that. And this experience is a rich resource that we can tap into as educators. And we can do this through things like group discussion, even simulations, problem-solving activities, doing case methods. Griffin also talks about allowing students to really explore terms and ideas, looking at what it means to them, and then applying it to their own lives and their cultural experiences. So here we want to aim for learning that's more active and collaborative and move away from this idea of the professor transmitting knowledge into these empty vessels that are the minds of our learners. We want to see ourselves more as a facilitator of learning in our role as an educator. And another way we can also do that is allowing for not only that peer-to-instructor interaction, but also allowing for peer-to-peer. And Knowles also points out that this vast experience can also have some negative effects. For example, our learners can come in with some habits and some biases that we need to help them examine. So a great way to do this is having our learners engaging in some critical self-reflection. And acknowledging our learners' experiences is also important with regards to self-identity. So for a lot of adults, their self-identity arises from their experiences. And Knowles argues that ignoring their experience can be perceived as not only rejecting or devaluing that experience that they're bringing to the classroom, but also potentially rejecting them as a person. And then principle 4 is readiness to learn. So adults value learning that integrates with the demands of their everyday life. So these real life situations that adults encounter often influence their readiness to learn. So for example, something that they need to learn how to do to cope with a real life situation. For example, a prospective parent may decide that they now need to learn more about infant nutrition, or an adult may decide to go back to school when they're ready for more responsibility in their career. To learning. So adults are more interested in immediate problem-centered approaches than subject-centered ones. So if we compare to educating children here a little, their learning and schooling tends to be more centered around subjects. Adults, however, may be more interested in devoting their energy to learning things that they are more life or problem-centered. So do they think it will help them with a task or a problem that they are encountering in their life? And Alan talks about tailoring course design to student needs, life experiences, and interests, which I think we can draw on here. And I think we can also help support this as educators by letting our learners draw on these real-life situations in their learning. So I try to do that in a lot of the assignments I assign, such as I usually allow my learners to be pretty creative with their final projects. And I let my learners do things like plan workshops and in-services that they actually want to host in their workplace. So it's allowing them to be more problem-centered in their education. Principle 6, to learn by internal motivation rather than external motivators. Now, this isn't to say that adults aren't motivated by external motivations. Getting a promotion, a higher salary can all be great motivators for adults. But Knowles points out that there can be very potent internal motivators that are driving our learners, like wanting more job satisfaction, quality of life. There's just professional growth. Now, Knowles in his book also talks about how we can apply these ideas to designing adult education programs. So his first one is talking about setting the climate for learning. So we want our learners to feel safe and comfortable expressing themselves in our classes. And this includes both having a comfortable physical environment, so things like comfortable chairs, appropriate temperature, lighting, acoustics, things like that. And like Griffin points out, if it's an in-person class, rearrange those chairs. Put them in a format that allows for a more collaborative learning experience. They suggest, I believe, a horseshoe or a semicircle. I personally like to push desks together so people can meet in groups and chat. And you also want to consider the psychological climate. So as educators, we want to foster qualities like mutual respect and trust, openness and supportiveness, collaboration, acceptance, authenticity, and even pleasure, because learning should be fun. We can involve our adult learners in mutual planning of relevant methods and curricular content. So for example, you can give your learners several optional possibilities for activities, and then let them or their groups pick and let them go with their preferences. Involve learners in diagnosing their own needs for learning, and that's going to help tie into this idea of internal motivation. And this is a great place where you can use things like self-assessment. Where possible, involve learners in formulating their own learning objectives. This gives them a little bit more control over their learning. So once again, tying into that idea of self-directed and independence. Involve learners in designing learning plans, identifying learning resources, and devising strategies for using resources to accomplish those objectives that they have set. Where possible, help them, and involve learners in evaluating their own learning, and this can help them further develop their skill of critical reflection. And so you once again can use self-assessment here, and throughout this process too, peer assessment can also be a great tool to use. I have a few questions here for you to reflect on and consider. So when we're considering Knowles' 6 assumptions of adult learning, how does this resonate with your own experiences as an adult learner? Do you think these principles are unique to just adults? And do you think these principles apply to all adults? Now, as you may have been able to guess from the questions I just posed, there are indeed some this theory or these principles within the literature. For example, these assumptions really tell us more about the characteristics of adult learners rather than the nature of their learning. So there has been a movement away from calling andragogy a theory and instead talking about it as principles of adult learning. And Knowles too later changed his position on this, recognizing that assumptions about andragogy are very situation specific and they're not necessarily unique to just adults. So he came to believe that there's a continuum ranging from a more teacher-directed pedagogy on one end and a more student-directed learning or andragogy at the other, with both approaches being appropriate to adults and children, depending on the situation. And there has also been some criticism that not all adults learn the same way. For example, culture will have an impact on learning, as will systems of oppression. And this isn't to say we can't bring ideas from adult learning theory or adult learning. There's a lot of really wonderful things we can glean from this, but this is just all critiques that we really should be mindful of. And there we have it for part 1. I promise part 2 of this will be shorter. We've already gotten some of the underlying history out of the way, and a lot of the concepts related to self-directed learning, experiential learning, and reflective learning are very much intertwined. In the meantime, let me know if you have any questions about andragogy, and I will see you all in part